Interdisciplinary is a word that you hear all the time to describe research and education at universities. Interdisciplinarity as it relates to research, as it applies to educational programs, and to the kinds of faculty, students, and staff that we bring to the university.
This is The Uncommon Engineer.
We're just absolutely pleased as punk to have you with us. Please say a few words.
Our guest today on the Uncommon Engineer podcast is Professor Raheem Beyah, Vice President for Interdisciplinary Research here at Georgia Tech. He's also the Executive Director of the online Master's Program in Cybersecurity, as well as a professor in the School of Electrical and Computer Engineering. Welcome to the program, Raheem.
Thanks for having me, Steve.
I think a lot of our audience has some familiarity with research, with the research that's done at universities. But before we dig into interdisciplinary research, can you describe kind of the high level, ecosystem for research at Georgia Tech and universities like Georgia Tech, why we do it, and how important it is to our mission?
Yeah, absolutely. I remember when I first started working on my PhD, and I was curious. I had no clue what this whole concept of research was. And as I started to dig in, I appreciated that really it was having the opportunity to go and try to discover what was next, the new in many different fields, from computer science to electrical engineering to computer engineering and manufacturing. It's how do we in a creative way think about different ways of doing things. And as you get a PhD, you're inventing something that's new, that didn't exist before. That's essentially a criteria. So that's the high level overview of research. And another way to think about it is as that we all play a small part in advancing technology. And so what you'll do is you'll have researchers that will have discoveries, they'll write papers, and then the next group of researchers will build upon that. And then, years later, you'll have something called the internet, for example, or you'll have smartphones, or you have satellites, or you have new vaccines and such. So it's really a community that builds upon itself. And ultimately, the goal is to improve the human condition in some fashion or another. At Georgia Tech, we conduct research. It's one of our sort of major thrusts. And we also have the Georgia Tech Research Institute underneath the Georgia Tech umbrella, in addition to the resident instruction side. And the resident instruction side is really more the professors that people know. And GTRI, the Georgia Tech Research Institute, they focus on applied research, which is getting it to the end user a lot quicker, the discoveries, than fundamental research. And we do over $1 billion of research at Georgia Tech, which is pretty doggone significant. And it in the last 10 years, we've actually about doubled the amount of research that we've done here on our campus, which is a big deal. It's so important because part of what it does is we are entrusted with resources from the state, from the federal government, and from companies. And it's nice to be able to demonstrate a return on that and ultimately push something back into the community and into society. And interdisciplinary research is essentially exactly what it sounds like, and it's multiple fields or individuals for multiple fields, coming together to solve various types of usually big problems where you really need different brains, a diversity of thought across different fields to solve big problems. Here at Georgia Tech, we have the concept of interdisciplinary research institutes, and we also have this concept of interdisciplinary research centers. And I'll talk about those just a little. So interdisciplinary research centers are really more grassroots type centers that were bottom up, where faculty members say, hey, this is something that's really interesting. And then they usually will partner with the college and maybe the EBPR's office and develop a center and work on certain things. So we have various types of those. So one of the examples is the machine learning center that's inside of the College of Computing. And then we also have these interdisciplinary research institutes, and those are really top down, if you will, and they're much more aligned with the institute's mission. And there are 11 different interdisciplinary research institutes. So there are executive directors that lead these institutes. And this goes from cybersecurity institutes to manufacturing to biosciences. But again, these are the fields that cut across many different disciplines.
We know so much of the research that I think the public thinks about is, research in physics and research in chemistry or in engineering, and I think I tend to think of that as disciplinary research. And so, can you say a little bit more about the kinds of interdisciplinary research that goes on at a place like Georgia Tech, like examples of who comes together, and why is it so important that that the interdisciplinary nature is essential to the research mission?
Absolutely. So that's a great question, and there are lots of examples. And what we're seeing actually is folks starting to converge to interdisciplinary research. I mean, we're trying to nudge individuals, but people, as you get to the bigger problems, you really need a bunch of different folks with different angles. So one example is actually the work that I do, which is cyber physical systems security. And what that means is, you have to understand let's say the engineering of a system. So you need a sort of an engineering background, depending on what type of system it is. Maybe it's let's say a manufacturing plant, for example. So you need to understand the engineering of the process itself. Let's just stick with that example. But then there's also software associated with this system. So that's really more of a computer science or computing type deal. So that's a nice integration of, you need multiple people that can understand the computing piece as well as the engineering piece to not just say, hey, my system was breached, but what I want to understand is what happens to the physical system if a breach occurs. Does this completely compromise my process? And that's the engineering and the controls associated with it. So that's one example. You also have biomanufacturing, for example, which is it's really hot right now, and that is manufacturing these various biological components. And to do that, you need expertise in manufacturing, and you also need expertise in biosciences. And again, when these folks come together, then they can produce really interesting work. AI is another example which sort of just cross-cuts everything. I mean, from research also to education, where you would need probably somebody that understands the computing aspects of AI, but you can also apply that to material science and use AI to create better material. So it's lots of examples I could continue to go on.
So your role as the Vice President for Interdisciplinary Research just sounds super exciting from the standpoint of you must be exposed to and get to see almost on a daily basis really, really exciting new ideas that our faculty or that GTRI is working on. Can you go through a couple things that are particularly catching your eye as maybe the next explosive areas for research?
Absolutely. So I get lots of folks coming to talk to me about great ideas, which is awesome. The negative part is that we can't fund them all, so that's kind of sad. But I really enjoy talking to folks, and AI is one of the areas that this folks come in from all over campus, which is great. I mean, from Scheller to College of Sciences and everything in between, talking about AI and just how it will evolve and how it will be applied to a bunch of different areas. Another really hot area right now that's important to the nation and important to us is additive manufacturing, and just how that will change the game in a number of different areas. Biomanufacturing is another area that's important, as well as quantum. Quantum is from the quantum physics piece all the way to the quantum computing piece. So it's really, the physicists to the computer scientists, right? It's all this sort of full stack type of area. So those are areas, and there are a number of others that, certainly I know we'll be investing in, as well as many of our peers.
And I know I mean, we're recording this right in the midst of the COVID-19 coronavirus spread of the pandemic. And can you talk about how you mentioned a little bit before how some of our corporate sponsors maybe pulled back a little bit, as things became more uncertain for them. But can you talk about what happened over the last 5 or 6 months to the research enterprise, and where's it headed? How has COVID affected the research enterprise?
Yeah, so one thing that's really neat is our faculty, our staff, our students are amazing and extremely resilient. And, our research productivity, we're actually up double digits from the previous year at the same time. So thankfully, the research enterprise is humming, and folks have been extremely productive. I assume that they're using the time that they got back from commuting in Atlanta traffic to write proposals. But we've been very successful. The enterprise is doing really well. Another nice piece is we in the EVPR's office, we did these COVID seed grants. And so in order to say, hey, this is an area that's important. Some of the things should address immediate response, things like PPE, but we also want to go off and think about, let's study this 15 years, 20 years, 30 years from now. So the EVPR's office, and I say in conjunction with GTRI, but GTRI technically is part of the EVPR, actually launched this call for COVID seed grants. So we have active seed grants right now from GTRI, College of Sciences, the COE, College of Computing, Scheller, and Ivan Allen. So all the way across campus, people are responding to our current crisis.
Can you say a little bit about some of those projects? I know it's always you never like to pick out one or two of the favorite projects, but you're right. It seems like the campus responded so quickly to the virus and contributed in so many ways. Are there a couple things in there that stick out in terms of that rapid response and rapid impact?
Yeah, well, there are a lot. I mean, certainly very familiar with the work that was done by many folks over in ME in terms of the PPE response and in partnership with GCMI, the Georgia Center for Medical Innovation. But we also have folks like that are outside the COE, like MG Finn, for example, in chemistry and all the sort of reagent creation and disinfectant testing and all the work that he's doing. We also have some work on looking at sort of capturing the virus in aerosols, in the aerosols, and being able to actually capture it and determine that it is there. And there are folks that are pivoting to see if they can not only capture this and detect, but can we create various systems to actually disinfect and kill the virus. So lots of really interesting projects that are there, again, sort of rapid response as well as the long-term response.
So do we have any faculty working on COVID-19 therapies, even far in advance kinds of work?
Oh, absolutely. One that comes to mind is one of our colleagues, Phil Santangelo, in biomedical engineering, and he has been awarded a really significant DARPA grant to accelerate some of the sort of respiratory therapeutics that it actually he's pivoting from another area and applied it to COVID-19, but it looks extremely promising. And I know that the DARPA is interested in him getting that work out as soon as possible. So folks are working around the clock in that space.
So one of the other things that I think a lot of folks have heard about as being affected by the pandemic are international students. And we do have international students that come to our campus to study for both undergrad and graduate programs. Can you talk a little bit about, first of all, the role of the international students that we have on campus and how this has affected their research or their ability to come to campus?
Sure. The international students, and I'll just sort of just speak for me personally and then make a broader statement. The international students have been amazing for me. My students that were international students that were graduate students. It's just no way in the world I would be as successful as I am now without the hard work of many of my students, and the vast majority have been international students. I think if we sort of make a more broad statement, the majority of our graduate students are international students, and they are, if you will, the research or the engineering engine of higher ed. And I think any opportunity to reduce those students will directly have an effect on our research enterprise as well as the research enterprise of other institutions. So I've had the opportunity to really spend time with my international students, my current graduate students that are from other countries, really just just taking their pulse, because there's just so much sort of chatter that's going on with the international students. And what's been concerning me is that they're very worried about their ability to stay in the country. And so what I've been doing just on a personal note is just making sure that they know that they have my support, and I really appreciate what they're doing. I mean, the work that my students do, I'm amazed by it. Every time I have a conversation with my students, they talk about really interesting topics, and they've advanced the research, and sometimes in ways I didn't even envision that it would go.
Well, I know that, and you're right. There's a lot of discussion in the popular media about whether too many international students are coming to universities. For us at the undergraduate level, only 10% of our students come internationally. And as you point out, for the graduate students, for master's and PhD students, we do have around 50% of those students. And I agree with you; they have been the heart and soul of not only our research enterprise, but those students do stay. Vast majority of them stay, and they go work for companies, and they do startups, and they're just a incredibly rich and important part. So I probably, like you, we're hoping that that as the pandemic passes, those students that aren't able to get into the U.S. right now, will be able to make their way to to campus.
Yeah, another quick anecdote on the international student piece, and certainly you don't expect a return when you take in students, but you fast forward, I accepted an international student, I don't know, maybe 7 years ago. He's now a professor in China at one of the top schools, but he's been reaching out to me to check on me to see if I'm doing well, and actually sending me PPE for my mom. So it's so much more than, like you mentioned, the research enterprise but they're good. It's just the folks I've dealt with have been good people, and they've, one of the best decisions I made 7 years ago was to accept that student, and now he's checking and worried about my health.
Yeah, they're bridge builders, right? Some in the popular press say, they're stealing ideas, but the reality is the vast majority of them are actually bridge building, some in research and some in personal ways that you just described. So that's great to hear. Well, one of the things that we always do on the Uncommon Engineer is we talk about your path to engineering, your path to being a professor, because so many folks have different ways of finding their way to what you do for a living. Can you talk a little bit about how you got interested in engineering and some of the key moments getting to where you are today?
Sure, happy to do that. So as a kid, and I have to be careful with my own son, and it'll make sense in a minute. But as a kid, I was very into video games, and it's the one thing that I keep telling my son to put down now. But I was so into video games, and I think my grandmother got me an Atari 2600 when it came out. It just changed my world. I mean, it's like, oh my God, this is amazing. I was maybe 7 or so. And as I continued to play these video games, I started wondering, you'll get to different parts and start questioning these parts. Well, why can't I do this? Well, this is only the path. It'd be really great if I can do these other things. And that got me to this whole concept of programming, and that it has this computer program, and if you could modify the program, then you could have these alternate paths that you would like. And so I really started going down the path of computer science and computer engineering, starting from these actual video games. As I got to high school, I realized that I was actually really good in math and science, and I really enjoyed math. I mean, I would just sit and work all the extra credit problems and all the difficult problems. And it's funny. I would go to these various study sessions, and I never thought I would actually teach or be a professor, but maybe this is sort of this thing that happened, many years ago, this foreshadowing. But I would go just to teach my colleagues. I knew all the stuff to teach all my friends, but I would always go because I was really good at explaining the material. Just fast forward with some, good advisors. As you know, I'm a very proud graduate of Atlanta Public School System, Frederick Douglass High School. So I had an amazing calculus teacher, Ms. Mills, and then also other advisors. And at that point, I didn't really know what an engineer was or engineer did. But I explained, like, here's my interest. I'm interested in computing, from a hardware and software perspective, and also have this strength in math and science. And fortunately, they said, hey, well, you should be an engineer. And I'm like, well, what is that? And it was like, well, these folks, they solve these problems in certain domains, and you have this background and interest, and you should be an engineer, or maybe a computer engineer or electrical engineer. And I said, okay, well, sure. I'll do that. So, I went to undergrad at North Carolina A&T State University. I wanted to leave Atlanta. And I applied to one graduate school, which, is yet another dumb thing that I've done in my life, even though I think we are the best. I always encourage folks to go look around. We're very confident that you'll come back. But fortunately, I was accepted to graduate school here at Georgia Tech and did master's and PhD. And, as I finished my PhD, I started trying to figure out, and I probably should have done this earlier, what I wanted to do with my life and career. My advisor, John Copeland, really grew up in industry. And so he didn't get to tech till mid-50s as a professor. So a lot of our work was very industry focused. A lot of contracts were industry focused. And so I was thinking I would go in that direction. And after I finished my PhD, I worked as a research engineer and still trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life. And so here's a nice turning point that got me really thinking about academia. I ended up teaching a class in computer science at Georgia State. I was a research engineer, so I was kind of managing my advisors group. And then the other piece that's really important, I was running a diversity program. So I was running the FACES diversity program that was started by Gary May many years ago. And I said, well, wait a minute, this is probably what I would be doing as a professor. I would probably be teaching, I would be conducting research, and I would be probably doing some sort of diversity initiative. And that's what got me thinking about academia. So I took 2 years gap between PhD and started my first faculty position.
Well, I really would like to hear more about your interests, the things that you're doing with regard to the diversity in STEM education. And I know, you went to an HBCU in North Carolina A&T and made your way to Georgia Tech and got involved in some diversity initiatives here. Can you talk about both how important it is to you personally and how important it is to the institution, and more importantly, the kinds of things that we should be thinking about to make sure that the Georgia Tech campus is more represents the demographics of the state of Atlanta and state of Georgia?
Yeah, happy to do that. I have diversity has been a passion of mine for many years, and I have probably over 2 decades of experience leading programs or building programs or being advisors for programs. And it's really starts from lots of informal and formal mentoring that I've probably participated in hundreds of those sessions and panel discussions and presentations and such. all the way to actually building programs, right? So I've built a program, started an organization along with Sam Graham and Barcola, chair of ME and the professor in ME, called Academic Research and Leadership Network. And the goal of that organization is to really increase the diversity in STEM inside of academia. So we have hundreds of PhDs and near PhDs that are part of this group. So I really have had a rich experience, and a big part of it is, especially the mentoring piece, is that there's no way in the world I would be where I am without a number of different mentors that I could go and just knock on the door and say, hey, this thing happened. How do I respond? And so that to me is really important. And I also have just seen that the difference between some people succeeding and not is just they didn't have access to a mentor or information. So I try my best to do that. I think we have to the data makes it very clear that having diverse teams gives you just a better outcome in pretty much anything we do. And that's all aspects of diversity. Most of my work has been in sort of ethnic and racial diversity, partly because that's where one of the major needs is, and that's where my expertise is. But in general, it makes sense to have a very diverse group, a diverse crop of folks. So you can look at problems in a different way and have the absolute best outcome. So as we move forward at Georgia Tech, I think we've actually made a good bit of progress. If you look at sort of African Americans in leadership at Georgia Tech, is something that I think we should be very proud of, and we should understand like how it happened. Because you start thinking about things that are structural in a negative way. I would argue that this may be structural in a positive way. So it'd be really interesting to figure out how this sort of thing happened, because we are much better than many places. We've done a much better job of having more women engineers, more Hispanic engineers, and I think we just have to continue. And I've consistently told folks that for diversity we just have to be intentional about it, and in an uncompromising way. And so even when times like COVID hit and you have budget constraints, we have to say this is critical to our mission, like everything else, and we just have to stay with it. So there's actually lots of low-hanging fruit that can be done to maintain and even improve diversity here on campus. And it's not fix the pipeline. The pipeline certainly is not where it needs to be, but there's so many things that we can do before we even get to the pipeline. And I like to say that we need a moonshot, but that's not necessarily an innovation. It's actually just being intentional about it. And by the time we are doing the things that are the, in quote, low hanging fruit, by the time we exhaust that, we would have fixed the pipeline, and that's down the line. So I think we have a lot of really, well-intentioned folks that are very interested in diversity here on our campus. I've had, on average, a really positive experience here, and especially from my colleagues in ECE, and some, unfortunately, across the country, that's not the norm. And so my goal is to try to make sure that people have the similar experience that I had as a colleague and a faculty member in ECE.
That's fantastic to hear, and it really is incredibly important, not only the present Georgia Tech, but to the future Georgia Tech, that we make, because I think in some ways, some of the things that you talked about is making sure that Georgia Tech is the most welcoming place.
Yep.
It is about pipeline. It is about, the things that we can do. But I think making it the most welcoming place, not just for Black students, not just for our Hispanic students, but for all students and faculty. So can't thank you enough for everything that you're doing to be to make a huge difference on those fronts. Well, Raheem, it's been fantastic to have you here on The Uncommon Engineer. Today, we talked about 3 of your hats. I have a feeling you have a couple more, but the contributions you're making in terms of interdisciplinary research, the online master's program in cybersecurity, and to your diversity efforts in engineering and STEM more broadly. In some ways, there's almost nothing you don't do on campus. And so we really, really appreciate all the contributions that you're making. I know we bump into each other all the time, and really looking forward to bumping into each other more and more. And I just want to thank you for everything you're doing for our campus, and thanks for coming on the Uncommon Engineer.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Steve. It's been great. And thanks for the invitation. I've enjoyed the discussion.